crime. You know, that thing that was almost solved by a flasher dog in the 1980s. But specifically, this story is about how we increasingly solve crimes using forensic evidence. It's that thing that is just a staple of TV crime shows.
Bullet from the torso on the left, bullet from the boat on the right.
2 hearts beat as 1. It matches up perfectly.
That's a match.
We got a match.
And they just found us a match.
Visible match.
New information shows how police used genealogy websites to try to identify the notorious Golden State Killer. Police arrested Joseph James DeAngelo on Tuesday after crime scene DNA partially matched a relative's on one of those sites. DeAngelo is accused in a decades-old crime spree across 10 California counties. John Blackstone is at the jail in Sacramento, where the 72-year-old will be arraigned this afternoon. John, good morning.
Good morning. Well, Joseph DeAngelo will face a judge here today at the Sacramento County Jail. The alleged Golden State Killer was careful not to leave behind any incriminating clues. He couldn't have possibly known he'd be unmasked by his own DNA more than 40 years later.
The Golden State Killer wore a ski mask and left no fingerprints while committing more than 50 rapes and a dozen murders. But he did leave behind his genetic code, the final piece of the puzzle for Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert and her investigators.
I believe very strongly that it's the greatest tool ever given to law enforcement.
Agents extracted the suspect's genetic profile from decades-old crime scene evidence and then searched genealogy websites for matches. They got a partial hit from someone related to Joseph James DeAngelo on GEDmatch.com. Police say another DNA test confirmed the 72-year-old ex-police officer was the Golden State Killer.
This place has been completely ransacked, and the CSI team behind me are searching for any scraps of evidence that they can find. But despite all the advances in technology, central really for the last 100 years has been the fingerprint for identifying suspects. But a new technology promises to bring this to a whole new level. These scientists from Sheffield Hallam University have joined forces with the police in the first trial of its kind. They say a fingerprint reveals far more than just a person's identity. It can provide vital clues about the suspect's activities hours before the crime took place. The samples are analysed here in the lab. They're looking for any trace, no matter how small, of substances hidden within or on the prints. They use a technique called mass spectroscopy. It helps them to find out what these chemicals are by seeing how they behave when they're fired through a magnetic field. To make it easier, let's imagine we have a ping pong ball, a football and a cannonball, and that the field is a steady stream of wind. If you throw the ping pong ball, the gust will have a big effect on its path through the air. The heavier football's journey is less affected, and the cannonball is pretty tough to move. By studying how these balls travel and where they end up can tell you a lot about what the objects are. And it's the same for molecules and atoms.
This was a crime scene mark found on a laptop, and so we analysed it. And this is a software that enables you to see the molecules distributed on this particular mark. And what we think it is here is cocaine, because the weight, or the mass to charge more technically, would correspond to that presented by cocaine. We can distinguish males from females, or we can understand whether or not a person has dealt drugs or actually taken drugs. We can detect ingested substances, so we may be able to reconstruct what that person has been eating just before committing the crime.
We're looking at a Ruger P90 DC.
When the crime scene tape comes down,
this is 45 auto caliber.
That's when the South Bend Police Department's crime lab gets to work.
Very busy, very busy. I average between 80 to 100 cases a year, and I'm already up to 135.
To the naked eye, you wouldn't know how these two shells are connected.
These two casings were actually fired from the same gun.
But to a forensic scientist, the casings offer important clues that could mean case closed.
I examined casings and bullets and bullet fragments and determined whether or not they're fired from particular guns or not.
Forensic science helps prosecutors get tangible evidence in cases where human testimony might be flawed.
Forensic science is important because it doesn't lie.
Without forensic science, there would be crimes that would go unsolved.
In the past, hair evidence was collected at crime scenes, but could only be used to identify a suspect with a microscope and an expert opinion comparing samples.
So that instead of relying on someone's opinion about whether something matches, you can make a measurement.
Using only an inch of hair, Brad Hart and Dion Annex
these are particularly selected ions
can identify the amino acids and peptides that make up your hair. So far, the degree of accuracy is 1 in a million after the hair is broken down into its parts.
We hope in the future to, of course, make that even better. We predict that if we had 100 of these identification markers in, say, an identification panel, you might say, for hair identification, this would be sufficient to get a unique pattern for a person out of the entire world's population.
I decided to have my DNA tested through Ancestry DNA. The big surprise was we're not German at all. 52% of my DNA comes from Scotland and Ireland. So I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt.
Ah, yes. Ads for genealogy sites like 23andMe and Ancestry.com are hard to miss. For a few $100s and a sample of saliva, you too can discover if your ancestors were kings and queens. Or, as we're learning now, someone much more sinister.
Had law enforcement never had access to genetic genealogy, I don't believe this case could ever be solved.
Last week, police in Washington state made an arrest in the 30-year-old killing of a Canadian couple. Victoria natives Jay Cook and Tanya Van Kallenborg were brutally murdered near Seattle in 1987. Police retrieved the killer's DNA from the crime scene, but back then it didn't match anyone on their database of known offenders. So the case remained unsolved until now, much to the relief of the victim's family.
It's a case that took decades to solve, but this past year, investigators unveiled the true identity of a suspected serial killer known as Robert Evans here in New Hampshire. According to the Attorney General's office, DNA testing led them to uncover his real identity, Terry Peter Rasmussen. Investigators say he's the man responsible for killing a woman and 3 children who were found in metal drums in Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown in 1985 and 2000. They also believe Rasmussen is responsible for the disappearance and death of Denise Bowden from Manchester.
The more precise that testing has become, the better these techniques become, the more useful they become to law enforcement.
The use of DNA databases and genealogy to help identify victims and suspects is proving to be an effective tool in solving crimes.